You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1977. On Thursday night, July 9th, Ted Outcolt and his wife Donna were very worried. They couldn't find Ted's 16-year-old stepson Eric Goldstrand. Eric and his girlfriend Lliana Adank, also 16, had left in Eric's truck around 4 p.m. to go to Broken Bowl campground to go fishing and swimming. But before they left, Eric and Ted discussed that Eric's 1953 Ford pickup was being wonky. They agreed that if he and Lliana weren't back by 10 p.m., Ted should come to the campground and find them, because that meant that the truck wouldn't start or had broken down. Well, 10 o'clock came and went. After waiting for a half hour and talking to Lliana's parents on the phone, Ted and Donna got in Ted's car and drove the 30-plus miles to Fall Creek. When they got to the campground area around midnight, Ted was sure he would see Eric's pickup and the two frustrated and tired teens waiting for rescue. Well, the truck was there all right, but Eric and Lliana were not. The truck, the lone vehicle sitting in the pitch-black parking lot, was unlocked and started when Ted tried the ignition. And both kids' clothes were folded in the truck, meaning that they were wearing only their bathing suits. That was very odd, and Ted started to get a little scared. He and Donna called out for the two, wondering where they could possibly be. They walked around the parking lot a little, but it was dark and silent. The woods formed an impenetrable black wall around them, and there was no sign of another soul around anywhere. Feeling helpless, Ted and Donna got back in their vehicle and drove to the nearest payphone about 4 miles down the road. They called Virginia Adank, Lliana's mom, and told her they couldn't find the kids. They told her they would stay there while she called the Lane County Sheriff's Office. Virginia reported to the dispatcher that the two teens were lost somewhere at Broken Bowl Campground. Lane County Sheriff's Deputy Dan Thompson heard a report of missing children on his radio at 1:33 a.m. He and Deputy Trainee Burr drove to the payphone where Ted and Donna were waiting. They followed the couple's vehicle to Broken Bowl, where they parked in the pitch-black lot at 2:10 a.m. next to Eric's pickup. Inspection of Eric's truck revealed nothing out of place. His wallet was still under the seat with cash inside. Deputy Thompson and the trainee used their mag lights and set out to try to find the teens. Donna stayed in the car. From the parking lot, Ted followed the westbound Fall Creek Trail while the deputies followed the eastbound Fall Creek Trail, off of which several short trails led to the river where the kids would have gone swimming. Checking each of these side trails, they searched for about 20 minutes. Finally, they came upon a picnic area on the banks of the stream about 100 feet from Eric's truck. At 2:34 a.m., the deputies' flashlight beams illuminated something pale in the blackness. Lying on the ground 5 feet from a picnic table lay a naked Lliana. She was dead from a visible gunshot wound to her forehead. Leaving trainee Burr to guard the scene, Deputy Thompson went to find Ted. Thompson told Ted to take Donna home and wait for word from the searchers about Eric. I cannot imagine the feeling of dread that must have taken over Ted when he heard that Lliana had been found shot to death. Eric was missing. He was either injured, also dead, or he had done something very bad to his girlfriend. None of the options were good. And it wasn't good. Far from it. Deputy Thompson had no radio reception in the park, so he left Burr with a shotgun and drove a few miles down the main road until he got a signal. Based on what he had observed about Lliana's body, he reported a possible rape homicide and requested sheriff's personnel and a supervisory sergeant. He then rejoined trainee Burr, who was probably not too happy standing in the woods in the middle of the night alone next to a dead body. Deputy Thompson said later that he assumed that the missing boy, Eric Goldstrand, had killed his girlfriend and fled. Sergeant Parker arrived at 3:24 a.m. and as the first command officer responding took charge of the scene. He was told that no one had been within 20 feet of the dead girl's body. He ordered a deputy Mumaw to close off the campground entrance and called in detectives and crime scene personnel. Captain Ron Eggleston and Lieutenant Hintz arrived at 4:07, Sergeant Langford arrived 3 minutes later at 4:10, and then Sheriff Bucks himself arrived soon thereafter. Detective Peckles and Sergeant Ripka arrived as well. This crime was a big deal for the Lane County authorities. They basically just held the scene, allowing no one to go in or out, because it was still pitch black and no one could see anything. They were concerned about destroying evidence and making themselves sitting ducks in the dark if the shooter was still around. They anxiously waited until the first glow of dawn brightened the horizon, and then they got to it. Sergeant Parker's report says, quote, "Between 5:30 and 6:30, myself, Sergeant Langford, and Deputy Burr made a search of the remainder of the campground known as Broken Bowl in an attempt to find the victim Eric Goldstrand with negative results." End quote. Well, that soon changed. At 6:20 a.m., Deputy Hintz found Eric. He was lying on his back behind a log in deep brush and fern fronds, just 25 feet east of where Lliana lay. He was wearing only his bathing suit, and he too had been shot. No gun was located near either victim. This was no murder-suicide. This was a double homicide. An officer Barnett had been assigned the unenviable task of going to the Adank residence at 4:45 a.m. and telling Lliana's parents that a female body had been found at Broken Bowl. Pretty soon the outcults, too, would get a knock on the door. As Donna later described it, a whole posse of men arrived at her doorstep at 8:40 a.m. on June 10th. Her ex-husband, Carl, Eric's dad, was there with her, waiting in agony for news of their son. Donna's pastor joined Detective Kennedy in informing the outcults and Carl that Eric was dead. Both teens had been shot and killed by suspect or suspects unknown. Detective William Kennedy was dispatched to the Adank residence on June 10th at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he advised Virginia and Daniel Adank that their daughter had been found deceased at the Fall Creek area. It was unthinkable. 2 teenagers had gone for a picnic in their bathing suits. They came home in body bags. Let's talk a little bit about who Eric and Lliana were. Eric Goldstrand was born on July 14, 1960, to parents Carl and Donna Goldstrand. Carl and Donna were divorced. Donna was married to Ted Outcult, a State Farm insurance agent, and Carl was remarried also to Brenda Goldstrand. Eric had a half-brother, Dan, and the two were close, with Dan looking up to his older brother. Now, in 1977, a month away from his 17th birthday, high school junior Eric was 5'11" and 160 pounds. His mother had legal custody of him, but for the 6 months leading up to his murder, starting in December 1976, he had been living with his father and stepmother and attending North Eugene High School part-time. He also worked part-time evening and weekends as a busboy at the La Cuisina restaurant in Springfield. Eric was on the football team at the high school, and he spent a lot of time lifting weights and playing basketball with his friends at the local Y. The week before he was killed, Eric had been asked to leave his dad Carl's house on Western Drive, and so had moved back in with Donna and Ted at their house on Country Lane in Eugene. Eric's parents were struggling a little bit with disciplining him. He was a bit of a handful. In April, Eric had been arrested for trespassing in an incident in which he and 3 other teenage boys broke into the above-garage apartment of another friend and hung out and smoked pot there. The property owners found them and called the police. They weren't going to press charges against the trespassers, but Eric's mother insisted to teach Eric a lesson. So 16-year-old Eric was busted by the cops for illegal drugs and trespassing. Eric's intake report by Counselor Ed Edinger says that, quote, Eric doesn't feel that he was doing anything wrong, and he doesn't feel that his friend or his parents really objected to his trespassing or wanted to notify the police, and that this is all the fault of Eric's mother, end quote. Edinger's report is pretty heavy-handed about Eric. I have to say I thought it was somewhat extreme, a reflection of the times, the tough love era and all. Eric's grandparents, Donna's parents, the Morgans, told Eric's counselor that he was a very respectful and compassionate grandson, a good boy at heart. But Edinger basically says that Eric is a discipline problem. He's doing poorly in school, is partying, and is using pot too much, is manipulative, and his behavior at home is questionable at best. He notes that while all 4 of Eric's parents seemed well-meaning and to love and want the best for him, essentially, they were too soft on him. For example, here's a statement from Edinger's report, quote, Eric is all talk and no action. He has tremendous potential in many areas and is not what I consider to be a criminal-type juvenile delinquent, but he needs firm and recognizable intervention and guidance from the juvenile department, which he is not getting from the parents presently, in order to help him better control and guide his own destiny, end quote. The counselor pointed to Eric's juvenile record, which included a shoplifting charge from 1974 for stealing a bottle of wine from a grocery store, and another in 1975 for stealing 3 candy bars, in addition to the recent pot-smoking trespassing arrest. The reality was Eric was dabbling in pot, and he was dealing a little bit of pot at the high school. And when I say dabbling, I mean that once in a while he would let his friends buy a little bit of pot off him if he had extra for some cash. Detective John Kilcullen found out about this when he sat down to interview Lliana's 3 good friends, all students at North Eugene High School on June 10th. This is the day after the murders. They said that Eric and Lliana were everyone's favorite couple and they worked really well together. But they admitted that Eric was known to sell pot around the school. Eric told Lliana that he made quite a bit of money doing that, but he may have been exaggerating. The girls said that Eric wasn't a very good businessman. He used quite a bit of his supply of pot himself and sometimes really didn't have much to sell. Lliana's friends said that she was a good influence on Eric and the two didn't smoke pot together because they didn't like how it impacted their relationship. Hence, Eric had been cutting back significantly on smoking since dating Lliana. As things stood when he was killed, Eric and Ted and Donna were getting along okay at home. Donna said that things were going pretty well and that Eric had grown up a little bit since he started dating Lliana 6 months earlier. She and her husband had an arrangement with Eric whereby he could live with them, but he wasn't to bring pot into the house and he was to keep them informed of his whereabouts. This is why Ted and Donna knew that Eric and Lliana were going up to Fall Creek to go fishing and swimming, and they knew where to find him when he didn't return home. In Eric's room, police found various love letters to Eric from Lliana. It was obvious that the teens were smitten with each other. Just as Lliana's friends had said, Eric's counselor noted that Lliana seemed to be a good influence on him. Lliana Adank was born on November 21, 1960, at Sacred Heart Hospital in Eugene, to an unmarried 17-year-old mother who had arranged for Daniel Adank and his first wife to adopt her child. Lliana had 5 older stepbrothers. The family lived in Eugene, but in 1971 they sold their house and moved to Wisconsin and lived on a dairy farm. They returned to Eugene in 1972, where Lliana's adoptive mother died of heart complications in 1973. Daniel remarried in 1974, and Virginia Adank, his new wife, became Lliana's mother. They supposedly got along well. Lliana attended James Madison Junior High and then North Eugene High School, where she was just finishing up the 10th grade when she was killed. Her father described her jokingly as good at spending money. She liked to buy clothes and makeup. But she was also a very good seamstress and made many of her own clothes. And she was super sporty. She was obsessed with horses and had ridden horses nearly daily since she was 7 years old. She also loved swimming and other sports, and both played and watched sports as part of her experience at North Eugene High School. Lately, Daniel Adank said Lliana's grades had started to slip a little bit. She was smart, but she didn't try that hard in school because she was more interested in boys. So both Eric and Lliana sound like pretty normal teens who were just trying to find their way in the 1970s. Eric had his problems with his parents, and the principal of North Eugene High School and Lliana's guidance counselor, Bert Simmons, said that Lliana was having trouble getting along with her parents too because she told him they were too strict. Lliana also admitted to Simmons that she thought she was drinking a little bit too much. He knew that she had gotten sick at a school dance and called one of her older brothers to pick her up. Some of her friends later reported to detectives that she did tend to get a little drunk at parties. But this didn't have anything to do with her murder. Simmons, the principal, said Lliana didn't have any enemies. The only person he knew of that she didn't like was the guy who had fired her from the Dairy Queen where she worked. This was her Dairy Queen boss, Frederick S. Fred told detectives Lliana had worked for him for about 2.5 months, but he had to let her go because she showed lack of initiative, flirted with boyfriends, and was not interested in working. It was her first job, and she was inexperienced and immature. But everyone liked Lliana, and she was smart, always smiling and bubbly, and no one could think of a reason anyone would want to hurt her. Okay, that's all a little background into who these teenage murder victims were. Now back to the crime scene. Eric and Lliana lay in place on the ground at the Broken Bowl campground until the crime scene had been photographed, measured, and searched. Detectives' notes documented the crime scene, and a little map was drawn with all the evidentiary items found. When daylight arrived while others were searching for Eric, at 5:13 a.m., CSI Deputy Peckles and Sergeant Ripka entered the perimeter around Lliana's body and processed the scene, taking photographs and measuring. Lliana lay on her back with her legs approximately 1 foot apart. She lay parallel to the picnic table, 5 feet away with her head pointed to the northwest. Her arms were bent up at the elbow around her head. She had clearly been wearing a small white bikini. The halter top and matching bottoms had been flung on the ground near a stationary grill installed on the other side of the picnic table, closer to where Eric's body was found. Next to the tossed-aside bikini scraps were 3 fishing poles and a yellowish-tan plastic tackle box that belonged to Eric, which was neatly placed at the bottom of the grill's mounting pole. A towel was under Lliana's head, and another white towel lay crumpled on the picnic table. These were collected into evidence. 2 pairs of shoes, a pair of flip-flops, and a pair of white Nike sneakers, identified as belonging to the teens, sat on the ground at the same corner of the picnic table where the towel sat. Deputy Thompson, the first responder's report, reflects his observations that, oddly, there were no signs of struggle whatsoever in or around the picnic area. The only thing he saw was some scuff marks in the soil about 15 feet to the west of the picnic table. He said, quote, "It was the most clean scene I've ever seen, and that's the only way I can describe it. It was totally clean. No shell casings, no broken branches, nothing. It was eerie." After Eric was found, Deputy Peckles and Sergeant Ripka also photographed and measured the area where his body lay. And then his and Lliana's bodies were removed around midday on June 10th for autopsy. Lliana was identified at Sacred Heart Hospital in Eugene by her older brothers, Rod and Rich, on June 10th at 4:32 p.m. Her autopsy started then, performed by pathologist Edward Wilson. Dr. Wilson measured Lliana at 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds. He noted no injuries, marks, or abrasions on her person. There was no evidence of a struggle or fight on her body. But Lliana had been shot 3 times. The first gunshot wound was below her left breast. The path of the wound passed through her heart and aorta. This gunshot wound was close contact, based on gunpowder residue 3/4 of an inch in diameter around the wound and stippling on the flesh. The second gunshot wound was the one seen by Deputy Thompson in the dark, in the middle of Lliana's upper forehead. This gunshot wound was surrounded by a 1¼ inch vertical ellipse of gunpowder and stippling. The bullet was recovered nearly intact from Lliana's brain. The third gunshot wound was in Lliana's left temple near her left ear. There was no gunpowder residue in the area. An irregular bullet fragment was found within her brain. The direction of the gunshot was from Lliana's left to right, slightly upwards and at an angle of about 30 degrees to 45 degrees with a mid-plane. This shot was from farther away than the other 2. Any one of the 3 shots would have been fatal, and it was impossible to tell which had occurred first. Dr. Wilson could find no evidence of sexual assault. Early stories about the case indicate that Lliana was not raped. I think this was because they presumed that semen, which was found inside Lliana's vagina, was from Eric. The lack of injury and trauma to her genital region, I think, swayed the pathologist into concluding there was no rape. But when Lliana was first found, semen was visible to the naked eye. In fact, it had been fresh enough that Deputy Thompson, who found Lliana first, noticed even in the dark of night that there was fluid dripping from her vaginal area at the scene. If you recall, he radioed in a rape homicide to the Lane County Sheriff's Office dispatcher. Detective Thompson's report was the only one that even mentioned sexual assault, though, and I'm not sure why. For years, the investigators struggled with lack of motive because the pathologist concluded there was no rape. Anyway, spoiler alert, Lliana was raped, and semen on physical evidence collected at the scene would prove that decades later. Eric's autopsy concluded that he, too, had been shot to death. He had 2 gunshot wounds, one in the middle of his upper chest, a ½ inch to the right of the midline. There was no gunshot residue around this wound. The direction of the gunshot was from front to back and from Eric's right to left at an approximately 30 to 45 degree angle. The bullet was recovered intact. The second gunshot wound was a grazing wound to Eric's scalp. It showed a trajectory of being fired from Eric's right back to left front at an angle of approximately 45 degrees with the sagittal plane. The bullet exited. He fell where he got hit in the brush off the small trail to the creek. The pathologist collected 4 bullets, some of them mangled, the 3 from Lliana and the 1 in Eric's chest. The one that grazed his scalp was not found. The bullets, the best evidence the early investigators would have in this case, were sent to the county crime lab for ballistics analysis. Captain Ron Eggleston, head of the sheriff's criminal investigation division, said later that the evidence showed that the murderer or murderers were within 10 feet of the teens when they were shot. The lack of injuries to their bodies, other than the gunshot wounds, indicated that they hadn't struggled with their shooters. In fact, the shot to Eric's head that grazed his scalp was believed to have been fired from behind as Eric was running away. Both teens were believed to have been killed in the evening hours on June 9th. On June 14th, the Adank and Goldstrand/Outcult families held a joint funeral for the teens at Wesley United Methodist Church. Students were the pallbearers at the somber affair, attended by more than 500 people. The parents requested that donations be made to a reward fund in lieu of flowers. 10 days later, on June 24th, the families jointly published a note in the Register-Guard just thanking the community that had rallied around them in their time of need and donated flowers, food, help, and concern. And in the 1976 to 1977 North Eugene High School yearbook, a page was inserted titled "A Sad Farewell." A photo of each of Lliana and Eric and the blurb, "Two good-natured and fun-loving members of the student body, Lliana Adank and Eric Goldstrand, died in early June while fishing near an isolated picnic area. They were both shot by an assailant and left at the picnic site. Lliana, a sophomore, and Eric, a junior, were described by many as happy, friendly kids who had been dating for most of the school year. They will be remembered by classmates as outgoing personalities who were better than average students. They died young, but their impressions on the lives of many would never be forgotten." That's the blurb that was in the high school yearbook. Okay, we're now going to backtrack back to the crime scene. Lane County deputies, detectives, the sheriff, CSIs, forest rangers, and everyone else descended on Broken Bowl Campground, located in the Willamette National Forest, at milepost 9.7 along Fall Creek Road in Lowell, Oregon. The park is on federal land and was patrolled by National Forest Service rangers. The Fall Creek Trail, along which the Broken Bowl Campground was positioned, commenced at the Dolly Varden Campground and ran along the river for several miles, connecting multiple campgrounds that were very popular with recreational campers, hikers, fishermen, bike riders, dog walkers, joggers, target shooters, teenagers, skinny dippers, motorcycle groups, and riffraff. In other words, an investigative nightmare. Eric and his buddies spent much of their leisure time up at Fall Creek, so did a lot of other kids from the Eugene area high schools and local colleges. At Broken Bowl, individual picnic tables were set in small clearings dotting the densely wooded area and were accessed by small trails diverging off the larger Fall Creek Trail. Deputies undertook an extensive foot search of the entire area, aided by Forest Service rangers. They found many shell casings on the ground, but these were all .45 caliber, .357 caliber, and shotgun shells, likely from people doing target shooting. They found some beer bottles and other items, but whether they were discarded by campers or someone more nefarious was anyone's guess. One thing they did take note of was a puddle of what proved to be motorcycle oil in a nearby parking lot. It's not clear where exactly this was found, as the notes from the early crime scene investigations are sparse or missing altogether. But the oil was fresh and was considered possibly significant enough that the investigators kept their eyes out for tips about people seen riding motorcycles in the area. And then this is a weird one. On Saturday, June 11th, at approximately 11:50 a.m., 2 Oregon State Police detectives, Shields and Gardiner, as well as Lane County Detective John Richardson, met with a forest ranger last name Soline who had found something. This was on Windberry Creek Road, several miles from the crime scene. Ranger Soline had found a North Eugene High School plastic library card in the name of Eric Goldstrand. The card was in 3 pieces, which were lying on the side of the road between Broken Bowl and Eugene. Detective Kilcullen went to the high school and inquired into the activity on Eric's school library card. He learned that Eric had only ever taken out 3 books, and none since March 1976. No one knew what to make of this. Eric's wallet was still intact under the seat of his truck. How did the library card get there? Speaking of Eric's truck, the police processed Eric's old Ford pickup, baby blue with gray primer spots, still parked in the parking lot for the Fall Creek Trail. They were able to obtain 28 prints or partial prints from the vehicle, many of which were Eric and Lliana's. The approximately 9 unidentified prints were years later submitted to APHIS, and they were never matched to anyone. Okay, let's talk about the timeline. Police worked hard to narrow down the timeline for when Eric and Lliana had been shot to death in a public park. That Thursday morning, June 9th, was nearly the end of the school year. Eric woke up at 8:30 and he and his grandfather installed a tape deck in his pickup and tinkered with the engine. Then Eric had a meeting at his workplace, the La Cuisine restaurant, and then he went to school for his afternoon classes. A part-time student, he only went to school for 5th and 6th periods daily, and he would typically be out by 1:30 p.m. Lliana, a full-time student, went to school that morning. In Detective Kilcullen's meeting with Lliana's friends at the principal's office, they said they last saw her around 12:15 that day. She said she was going to skip the rest of the school day and go home and sunbathe. And then she was planning on going up to the Fall Creek area with Eric, just to hang out and fish and swim. It was learned that after school on that Thursday, Eric had stopped by his bank, Home Federal Savings and Loan, and made a withdrawal of $5 in cash at 2:47 p.m. He told the friendly teller there whom he knew, Mary Dunham, that he and his girlfriend were going up to Fall Creek to go swimming and he needed the money for gas. He gave no indication that they were planning on meeting anyone else there, and implied it was just the two of them going. He said his girlfriend was waiting in the pickup truck. Irene said Eric was in a very good mood and that things were going well between him and his stepfather. So we can surmise that Eric had picked Lliana up at her house. The last time Virginia Adank had heard from her daughter was when she got home from her shift at Sacred Heart Hospital and found a note from Lliana saying, "Eric and I have gone to Fall Creek to do some fishing and swimming. We won't be back before dark. Love you." After the bank, the teens drove back to Eric's house to pick up the picnic dinner Donna had made for them. Eric had told her the two were heading up to Fall Creek. She had prepared a dinner for them in a large Safeway shopping bag containing a ridiculous amount of food. 2 bottles of Diet 7-Up, 2 egg salad sandwiches, 2 tuna salad sandwiches, 2 oranges, 2 pieces of celery with peanut butter, some cheddar cheese, some pretzels, some dill pickles and some sweet pickles, some chocolate stars, banana chips, and a bottle opener. My kid gets a turkey sandwich and a granola bar. Anyway, Eric was wearing jeans and a tank top, and he told his mom he had a bathing suit on underneath. Donna was worried about him not having enough gas for the 30-mile trip, but he told her he had put $5 worth in the pickup. Then they negotiated the time he would be home. He said he'd be home by 11. Donna said that's too late, be home by 10. This is when they had the conversation about if Eric wasn't home by 10, it meant that his truck was on the fritz and he would call or they should come find him. For now, though, the truck was running fine. Eric and Lliana left the house right around 3:45. After that, Eric's stepmother, Brenda Goldstrand, was one of the last people to see the teens. She told Detective Kennedy that at 4:05 p.m. or thereabouts, Eric had stopped in at her and Carl's house at 3583 Western Drive. Lliana stayed in the truck. Eric just ran in to grab 2 quarts of oil and 4 cassette tapes. Eric had already been at the house earlier that day to pick up the gold tackle box and some fishing gear and worms, which were all already in the truck. He was in and out of the house in a couple minutes, and the two were off. A friend of Eric's who went to junior high and high school with him said that afternoon he happened to be on Main Street in Springfield, and he saw Eric and a female passenger drive by, sometime around 4:15. Everything appeared to be normal. So the investigators now knew that the teens had left the area and headed up to Fall Creek sometime around 4:15 p.m. Detective Kilcullen reenacted the drive the teens would have made from Eugene to Broken Bowl. Carl Goldstrand told the detective that his son usually took the route through Jasper. He also said that Eric would always drive his pickup as fast as humanly possible, but the old truck wouldn't go more than 60 miles an hour, and it would also have to downshift into second gear to handle the corners on the curvy back roads to the campground. The detective reenacted the drive, careful never to exceed the speed limit, and slowing down for all corners and accelerating out of the corners. The trip took him 54 minutes for the 32 miles. Ted Outcult, on the other hand, told the detective that sometimes he and Eric went out to Fall Creek via Highway 58. So the detective drove that route home, and on this trip it took 53 minutes. So now they knew that the kids likely arrived at the campground by 5:15 p.m. By 10 p.m., they were either already dead or were being held hostage or incapacitated by someone or someone's unknown. The investigators began the incredibly tedious process of tracking down all campers in the area, identifying all vehicles seen in the area, and conducting interviews to see if anyone had seen or heard anything at all. Of course, they were interested in whether anyone had heard gunshots, This was an incredibly popular area with lots of recreational outdoors people. Someone must have seen or heard something. And they pretty quickly found two witnesses who had actually seen the kids. Randy Hoffman and his girlfriend Kathleen Nelson were interviewed by Springfield PD CID investigator James Halford on June 13th. This couple had spent the late afternoon on June 9th at the Bedrock campground. Kathleen said they parked at Dolly Varden campground and then walked along the Fall Creek Trail for 2 miles or so. At a small campground area that she didn't know the name of, she said they saw two young people wading in the river in the general area that turned out to be Broken Bowl. Quote, she described the white male juvenile as having medium-length brown hair, not wearing a shirt, holding a fishing pole, and the other object which appeared to be a fishing tackle box in his hand, while he was holding hands with a white female juvenile. This white female juvenile was about 8 to 10 inches shorter than the male and had dark hair, medium length, possibly curled at the ends, wearing a dark-colored swimming suit or halter top and matching pair of bottoms, end quote. So this sighting was almost certainly of Eric and Lliana. Lliana's bathing suit was actually light-colored, but the rest of the description is spot on. Kathleen Nelson went out to the area of the double homicide with Detective Kennedy and investigator Jim Sharp and pointed out the area where she'd seen the couple in the river. Based on her report, the detectives determined that the sighting of Eric and Lliana in the river was sometime between 5:36 and 5:51 p.m. Then, a Gordon Ranta reported that he had been fishing in Fall Creek at approximately 7:30 p.m. on Thursday the 9th. He was literally standing in the river and fishing when he heard 3 shots. Specifically, he heard 2 shots, a slight pause, and then a third shot. He got the impression it was a small caliber gun because there was no echoing sound afterward. Gordon didn't think much of the shooting sounds because he spent a lot of time in the woods and had regularly heard people hunting and doing target practice. He wound up his fishing and went back to his car sometime between 8:30 and 9. It was starting to get dark at that point. The detectives did an experiment where Detective Richardson waded into the river right where Henry had said he was standing, while Detective Cordell shot a .22 caliber revolver up at the campsite. They determined that Richardson could indeed hear some of the shots. So now they had the witnesses who saw Eric and Lliana alive in the river sometime before 6, and they had someone who heard gunshots in the area around 7:30. This timing was consistent with the very approximate time of death in the autopsy reports. And also, the detectives noted that Eric and Lliana had eaten. The food Donna had packed up for them had been partially consumed and then packed back up. Some of the photos from the crime scene showed the Safeway bag on the picnic table. The kids must have been hungry after swimming and fishing. The timeline was all coming together. Now they had a better sense of what had happened here based on the witness accounts, the sounds of the shots, the physical evidence at the crime scene, what the kids were wearing, and the gunshot wounds on the bodies. Captain Eggleston, the lead investigator, later spoke to the Register Guard about their investigative theories at the time. Quote, Eggleston has little doubt in his mind that Eric and Lliana fell victim to a would-be rapist. End quote. Eggleston believed that Lliana and Eric had been sitting together at the picnic table when the killer arrived. Quote, someone obviously just walked in on them, and by the time they realized things weren't good, it was too late. End quote. Eggleston concluded that Lliana was ordered to take her swimsuit off, probably at gunpoint. It's the way the suit lay next to her body on the ground, he said. Remember, I said that it had been tossed aside. Eggleston seemed to think that because Lliana didn't fold it and put it on the table and instead dropped it in the dirt, it meant she was ordered to take it off. Apparently, the lack of any injuries to her body or sign of a struggle indicated to the investigators that the bikini was not forcibly ripped off her by the suspect, but rather was removed by her under duress. Officer Dan Thompson said later that it was evident to them that Eric had been trying to run from the slayer. He said, quote, it would appear that he was trying to run away, and one shot was fired that knocked him out, and the other fatal shot, they walked up on him and shot him, end quote. He agreed with Eggleston. Somebody came upon the two kids and held them at gunpoint while they raped Lliana, and Eric broke away and ran and was shot. But who? Was this just a random stranger who came upon these kids at a campground and decided he wanted to rape Lliana and was willing to kill for it? This all reminds me of the Ellen Matthews and David Schulde's case I covered. They were shot in a campground in Wisconsin by a stranger, Raymond Van Nieuwenhoven, who, decades later, was tried and found guilty for their murder. Or, in the alternative, was this someone who knew the kids and had a beef with them, or was stalking Lliana, or had some other agenda? Detectives desperately wanted to find out. Very quickly, Eric and Lliana's friends, schoolmates, co-workers, extended family, and everyone else the detectives could think of were interviewed. Almost all the guys were asked about their whereabouts on the night of Thursday, June 9th. The detectives asked pointed questions of all these people, trying to determine whether someone Lliana and or Eric knew had gunned them down at Broken Bowl. For the record, they noted that Donna told the detectives that the kids didn't usually go to Broken Bowl. They usually went up to Cold Creek. So when she and Ted drove up there that night, they had to drive around for a little while to find Eric's pickup truck, and they were a little surprised to find it at Broken Bowl. In family interviews, detectives found out from Lliana's father that she had a long-standing feud with a neighbor kid, last name Bender. In June 1974, Daniel Adank had actually reported to the Lane County Sheriff's Office that this kid had been harassing his daughter, doing things like breaking her bicycle, pointing a BB gun at her, and running into her with his bike. Daniel Adank also told the detectives about his daughter's ex-boyfriends. A few years earlier, Lliana had become involved with a boy named Brent who lived nearby. There was a guy whom she had casually dated at school right before Eric. And they also mentioned a Steve who was older than Lliana and seemed overly interested in her even though she had rejected him. All these guys had to be investigated. And so did Lliana's ex, Sean S. Detective Kilcullen contacted Lliana's ex-boyfriend Sean S. at 5:50 p.m. on Thursday the 14th. He was employed at True Line in Eugene, a business owned by his father. Sean told the detective that he had gone with Lliana on and off since 1972 when they became neighbors. His family moved to Jasper in 1974, but the two continued to see each other. They broke up and got back together several times because the long distance didn't really work. The last time they broke up was in October 1976. They continued to talk on the phone, though, and he last talked to her when she called him at his home about a month before her death. They had a plan to go to dinner, but she wasn't able to go because she had to work at Dairy Queen. So he went to the Dairy Queen and hung out with her for about a half hour while she was on her shift, and he hadn't talked to her since. Detective Kilcullen asked Sean for his father's alibi for the night of June 9th. He said that he worked that evening at his father's business. He got off work between 7:30 and 8, went to dinner with his parents, and then spent the night at home. His parents confirmed this alibi, but Sean's name would come up again years later. One early potential lead emerged when Detective Kilcullen searched Eric's bedroom. There he found marijuana paraphernalia and a notepad with various names and dollar amounts listed on it. It appeared to be a customer list. Carl Goldstrand told Detective Kilcullen that he'd found out Eric was selling small amounts of pot, and he'd forbidden Eric from bringing pot into his house. Eric continued to violate that rule, which is why Carl kicked Eric out, and he went back to live with Donna and Ted. Carl said he'd been on Eric's case about marijuana use, but Eric had been telling him to leave him alone and that he would get it straightened out. Carl believed his son was working on the problem. But the scale and mini plastic bags and other stuff found by the detective in Eric's room made rumors of Eric's drug selling a little more concrete. And several of the kids at the high school had said Eric was a low-level dope dealer. The question was, how significant was this angle? Detective Kilcullen gathered a few tips and rumors that Eric and Lliana had gone up to Fall Creek on a drug buy. For example, one tip that came in on June 18, 1977, from an anonymous caller said rumor had it that Lliana and Eric were killed because they had found a plot of marijuana and were cultivating it and selling the drugs for a profit. The tipster said that the pot plot was owned by an organized outfit in West Eugene and that they had killed the teens in a territorial dispute over the marijuana growth operation. So all of this stuff was pointing to Eric having significant involvement in pot sales and distribution. Was the killer a disgruntled pot customer, a marijuana source whom Eric had upset or angered, territorial marijuana growers, as the tip indicated? It definitely wasn't out of the question, especially after Detective Kilcullen interviewed a friend of Eric's, Toby G., on June 10th. Toby said he believed Eric owed a guy named Jack $60 for drugs. It wasn't a lot, but back then a Snickers bar cost a quarter. That's 240 Snickers bars worth of money. And Eric had once been arrested for stealing 3, if you remember. Again, it wasn't nothing. This drug creditor named Jack was easily found by Detective Kilcullen. He contacted him on the 17th and interviewed him extensively. He had worked with Eric at La Cuisina, and they hung out outside of work. Eric had been over to his house to party with Jack and his roommates more than once. Jack said he had sold Eric small amounts of pot on 3 occasions. Eric owed him $15, not $60, and he hadn't seen Eric since May. Jack had an alibi in that he was with his roommates and some female friends for the entire evening of the murders. Lliana's friends pointed Detective Kilcullen to another student at North Eugene High School, whom they said was an accomplice of Eric's in his pot-selling business. His name is redacted in the file I received because he was a minor. Anyway, the word was that this kid was the one who sold most of the drugs. Detective Kilcullen tracked down this boy who denied that they were partners in any drug-selling business at the school. He said that Eric had maybe purchased some pot from some guy he knew named Jack and had sold it to some other kids, but it was a tiny operation. We're talking $5 and $10 worth of pot, period. This kid also had an alibi for the night of the murder. He'd been at work at Gatehouse Pizza and got off at 12:40 a.m. Detective Kilcullen gathered this same information from a number of different people. Rumors of Eric's life as a drug lord were greatly exaggerated. He was just a high school kid who occasionally let his friends buy some pot off of him, and that was it. Lliana's friends all swore that Lliana and Eric did not smoke together, and there was no evidence of any drugs whatsoever found up at Fall Creek, where Eric and Lliana's bodies were. Eric's minuscule drug operation certainly did not seem to be motive for the double murder, and in fact, no one could think of any motive at all. To a man, all of Eric's friends, and he had a lot, going back to grade school, said he was a super guy, everyone liked him, and no one had any problems with him. Even a guy who had previously dated Lliana for a couple months that past fall told Detective Kilcullen that Eric was a great guy. The detective interviewed several football teammates of Eric's who said while he was aggressive on the football field, he generally didn't get into fights. Same thing for Lliana. Everyone liked her. Her biggest problem was that she butted heads with her parents. They had recently grounded her after she was caught drinking at a party, but that was normal teenage stuff and had nothing to do with her death. There simply was no other drama. Detective Kilcullen took note, though, that most of the kids he interviewed in the week after the murders knew that Lliana and Eric were headed up to Fall Creek on that Thursday afternoon. They pretty much told everyone they saw that day. If someone wanted to find them, they didn't have to try very hard. Next, they turned to Eric's coworkers at La Cuisina restaurant. Eric had attended an employee meeting there on the morning of the day he died, and all his coworkers knew he was going up to Fall Creek later that day. But the detectives simply couldn't find anyone who worked with Eric at the restaurant who had any kind of problem with him. He was described by coworkers as a happy-go-lucky kid who was a pretty good worker. Other than the loose pot connection to the former La Cuisina employee Jack, there was nothing. Lliana's father, Daniel Adank, was questioned a number of times. Daniel had an alibi. He and a neighbor were working on his truck. The neighbor verified this. But the police wanted to be sure the neighbor wasn't covering for him, so Daniel was requested to submit to a polygraph exam in October 1977. He was questioned about his knowledge of the murders, but he was deemed to be telling the truth by the polygraphers. Once the detectives had made their way through all the personal connections of the teens, the investigation expanded to explore the theory that the teens had been killed by a stranger, someone who happened upon them at Broken Bowl that evening. The rest of the investigation consisted of exploring people who were reported to be in the area, people who were the subject of tips, and violent criminals who might have crossed paths with the kids. They checked the campgrounds in the area and tried to talk to everyone who had camped there about whether they had seen or heard anything. They worked with the U.S. Forest Service personnel who patrolled the park and gathered information on shady people known to them. They checked with logging company employees who were working in the Willamette National Forest that day or who lived in the area. At this time, the logging industry in this part of Oregon was booming, and there were lots and lots of transient logging company workers to keep track of. Police also stopped cars passing through the Fall Creek area in the days after the murders to see if drivers had witnessed anything. Another smart thing they did was pull all the records of the OSP and Lane County traffic stops in the Fall Creek area from the week of the murders and check into all the persons named in those reports. Another angle the police dug into was trying to log and track down all vehicles seen in the area on June 9th to 10th. In the days before traffic cams and camping logs, this was a tall order. After Lliana's body was found at 4:10 a.m., Deputy Mumaw set up a roadblock at the main gate to Fall Creek Park to force anyone driving in or out of the park to be logged by the officer. The drivers at this early hour consisted primarily of log truck drivers and some campers. But for any time before the roadblock started, the investigators had to rely on witness reports of cars, trucks, and motorcycles in the area. For example, Kathleen Nelson reported that when they parked at the Dolly Varden campground, there was a blue Datsun pickup, approximately 1968 to 1971, parked there unattended. Several other witnesses also reported a blue Datsun pickup that was in the area that day. Another vehicle seen by multiple witnesses, including Ted and Donna, when they drove up to Fall Creek, was an orange VW Beetle with a broken windshield and Massachusetts plates. Others reported seeing an odd-looking homemade camper on top of an old pickup. The camper was made of wood and looked like a mini shack. Still another vehicle reported was a dark-colored 1962-era Ford Falcon with one broken headlight. And finally, the area was popular with motorcycle riders, and several of these were reported to the police. A June 11th article in the Springfield News reported that police were trying to round up the owners of 30-plus vehicles seen in the area around the time of the murders. That's a lot of vehicles, and of course, they had no way of knowing whether any of them were driven by the killer or whether he had driven to the scene at all. One piece of concrete evidence that the police had to go on was the ballistics evidence from the lead tip bullets. The gunshots were determined to be from a .22 caliber handgun. The ballistics analysts believed that the gun used in the shooting was a specific kind, a Liberty or a Rome. Anytime a gun like these or anyone with a gun like these came across the investigators' desks, they checked them out. Anyone who had been arrested in Lane County carrying a gun like this was vetted. A lot of people owned guns in this area, and a lot of guns were collected from people for test firing and then returned to their owners after the ballistics didn't match up. One local known to the cops was checked out just because he had been arrested before, he carried a Rome, and he was known to camp in the area. Let's talk about some early creeps and persons of interest police spent some time on. One of these was a juvenile, last name Calloway. On the morning after the murder, Friday, Sergeant Parker's report says that around 8:20 a.m., quote, I located Calloway walking down the river and picked him up and returned him to Captain Eggleston for an interview. Calloway reported he was camping in the area at the Dolly Varden campground right down the road from the murder scene. It turned out that Calloway had run away from a foster home on June 1st. Calloway acted very nervous when Captain Eggleston questioned him. He didn't want to give his real name, and he seemed evasive and shady. His foster parents, when they were finally tracked down, said that Calloway had quite a temper and was a loner who liked guns and liked shooting guns. Calloway told the police that on the evening of Thursday, June 9th, between 3 and 10 p.m., he'd been at the river fishing alone. Then he went back to his campsite near the first bend east of Dolly Varden, made a campfire, and went to sleep. Police looked extensively into Calloway, but he was found not to be in possession of any gun, and he denied committing the murders. He also submitted to a polygraph. Police wrote him off as a suspect, but did put some stock in some information he gave them. Quote, he advised that during some point in time after he'd been fishing, he heard what sounded like firecrackers or gunfire. He stated he heard one report, followed by several seconds of silence, and then two reports together, followed by several more seconds of silence, followed by a fourth and final report. Calloway also added two vehicles to the suspicious vehicle list, a 1972 Ford Pinto and a green 1969 or 1970 Pontiac GTO. Then there was the guy I'm calling the exhibitionist. The Lane County Sheriff's Office received a call from a Lillian A., who related the following. On the day of the murders, June 9th, around 1 p.m., she and her dog had driven up to Fall Creek to a favorite spot of hers to sunbathe. This was at the end of a dirt road off of Fall Creek Road near Puma Campground. She was lying in the sun, and a man drove up and parked next to her. She noticed he was drinking a Miller. He walked down to the stream, but 2 or 3 minutes later appeared next to her and said, I'd like to F you. She returned some profanities to him, and he bent down and grabbed the left top strap of her bikini top and tried to pull it off. It came about halfway off, but she managed to push him away and threatened him with a rock she'd picked up. She told him she'd bash his head in with the rock if he came near her again. He backed away and said, okay, and got in his car and drove away. Detective Kilcullen had Lillian do a composite sketch of the man she saw. He was a white male, 23 to 24 years old, of medium build, approximately 5'9", with light brown hair cut in layers and bangs on his forehead, and a wind-blown center part. He had a mustache and blue eyes. He was driving a rust-colored American smaller car on the newer side. Months later, in October 1977, Lillian A. agreed to be hypnotized to enhance her recall of the man who had assaulted her. While hypnotized, she worked with a sketch artist who was able to create what Lillian said was a good likeness of the man, and she was able to remember that his car was a brown Camaro. Another woman, Terry E., called the police and related an incident that happened on June 9th as well. She was fishing with friends in the Fall Creek area, and she drove to a nearby convenience store to get some snacks for the fishing party. As she drove back toward the creek area, she noticed a car following her. The male driver pulled up alongside her, and because she was in a pickup up high, she could see down into his car, and she could see he was naked and masturbating. Terry, too, was hypnotized in October 1977. She described the masturbating man as a white male in his early to mid-20s with dark hair, 5'8" to 5'9", about 140 pounds. His car was a burgundy Camaro. Sounds like the same guy to me. One woman reported that she and a group of friends had been swimming at the Bedrock campground at Fall Creek during the late afternoon of July 9th. A group of about 6 guys who were sitting there drinking beer started catcalling them, so the women left. She saw the group of men in their 20s laughing as they walked over the bridge toward Broken Bowl. And Kathleen Nelson, the woman who had seen Lliana and Eric in the river before 6 p.m. on the evening they died, saw a number of people on the trails that day. One was notable because he looked suspicious. He was a white male, 6'1" to 6'2", about 160 pounds, mid-20s, with dark brown or black hair worn in braids, well below his shoulders. He was wearing cut-off jeans and no shoes, and his feet had dried mud on them, and he looked very spaced out. The guy gave her the creeps. All these names, leads, tips, and sightings were documented and tracked down, or the police did their best they could to try to track them down. And believe me when I tell you, there were hundreds and hundreds more of these tips that I am omitting from the narrative. Despite the plethora of information, the Register Guard reported on June 30th, 1977, that Lane County Sheriff David Burks said his office had no new leads. Burks said, quote, "We are working very actively on it." And they were, to no avail. Weeks and then months passed as the investigators were working on all these leads, none of which proved to be overwhelmingly significant. 1978 rolled around and the case dragged on. In February of 1978, the Lane County Sheriff's Office requested KUGN Radio to broadcast the following message. It said, "Any person having information regarding the homicide which occurred on June 9th, 1977 in the Fall Creek area, contact the CID section of the Sheriff's Office," and it gave a phone number. Sergeant Kennedy and Captain Eggleston were the contact persons. Lane County Sheriff David Burks told the Register Guard the plea for information was issued because his team was, quote, "very short on leads." That year, 1978, the investigators received word of another startlingly similar murder that had happened in Walla Walla County, Washington. On Sunday, July 13th, 1975, at approximately 5:30 p.m., Susan Patricia Savage and her boyfriend Patrick Allen Oliver, both in their early 20s, were shot to death in a recreational area 12 miles east of Walla Walla. That morning, Patrick had picked Susan up at her house and they drove to a popular swimming hole at Mill Creek. Their bodies were discovered on Monday afternoon around 2:30 p.m. by relatives who had gone to the area looking for them when they didn't come home the night before. The investigation determined that Susan and Patrick were shot near the stream where they were picnicking, and then their bodies were dragged to an area of heavy underbrush. The case sounds incredibly similar to Eric and Lliana's, but there were some differences. One, the bodies of Patrick and Susan were stacked face up one on top of the other, and farm equipment placed on top of them. Two, the murder weapon was a .38 or .357 caliber handgun, not a .22. In January 1979, Detective James Wolcott of the Lane County Sheriff's Office consulted with the Walla Walla Undersheriff Buzz Clunt and Chief Criminal Deputy Randy Taylor to compare notes about the unsolved double homicides. The problem was, both cases were just that, unsolved. Investigators were left to marvel at the similarities but scratch their heads as to any connectedness. Remember Susan and Patrick's case, though. I will circle back to it later. In 1985, the parents decided to give the reward fund, still about $2,500, to charity. An article in the Register Guard says, quote, "They have given up hope that the guilty party or parties will ever be known. The only chance is if someone confesses someday, and I don't really believe that will ever happen," Virginia Adank said. "I'd rather the money go to a worthy cause instead of sitting in the bank." In 1986, Deputy Kurt West was assigned to the case. He worked it for years, doggedly following all leads, however small or seemingly tangential. One of the priorities for Detective West was to revisit some former suspects. One of these was Dwayne Lee Little, who had been only 16 years old when he raped and stabbed to death 16-year-old Orla Faye Phipps of Springfield, Oregon, in 1964. Little was sentenced to life in 1966 and began his sentence as the youngest prisoner in the Oregon State Penitentiary system. But not for long. Little was paroled in 1974, although his parole was revoked in 75 for possession of a firearm and he was reincarcerated. He was paroled again in April 1977 and was living in Portland when Lliana and Eric were killed in June of that year. This brought him to the attention of the Lane County investigators, who thought it was too much of a coincidence that the teenagers were killed within 2 months of this murderer's release. Little went on to rape another woman. In 1980, he picked up a hitchhiker and raped her and slashed her with a knife as she jumped out of his vehicle to escape. This time, the judge sentenced him to 80 years. Little's father had also murdered someone, his own half-brother, and been sent to a state mental institution. For a period of time in 1977, Dwayne Little was the prime suspect in Lliana and Eric's murder. When he was interviewed, he denied shooting the two and said he was working a swing shift in Portland at the time. 1977 investigators confirmed this. It was impossible for Dwayne Lee Little to have been in the Fall Creek area on the evening of June 9th, 1977. Detective West went on to confirm this alibi. Another viable suspect eliminated. However, as an aside, Dwayne Lee Little remains a chief suspect in the unsolved murders of the Cowden family, killed while on a camping trip in Oregon in 1974. Aside from vetting actual suspects, much of Detective West's time was spent reviewing the case file and re-examining old tips and leads. There were so many that had come in back in 1977, there was concern that something important could have been missed or that people who were the subject of the tips had been prematurely ruled out. Consequently, Detective West looked into a guy named Jerry S. Jerry had been the subject of a tip called in on August 19, 1977 by his friend Ed. Ed reported that he'd been up at Fall Creek with Jerry and they'd seen a young couple skinny dipping in the creek. The couple had bikes with them. Jerry remarked to Ed, referring to the female of the couple, "I'd like to F the baby fat off her." Okay, fine. A distasteful, repugnant comment by a creep. Why was that enough to rouse police interest in Jerry? Well, Jerry had a reputation for being obsessed with guns, carrying guns, and using guns. He was aggressive by nature, a loner who bullied area residents. He was known to spend a lot of time in the woods alone. He had a low-level record for typical stuff like disturbing the peace. Several tips had come in about Jerry, from people who heard him brag at the Unity Tavern near Fall Creek about seeing a skinny-dipping couple at Fall Creek and blowing them away. In late 1986 or early 1987, Detective West spent a lot of time interviewing people who had called in tips about Jerry. One of them, a guy named Don, said he heard this bragging from Jerry and called it in because he knew this guy was capable of killing those kids up at Broken Bowl. Detective West tracked down Jerry on May 6, 1987. From the start of the interview, Jerry was hostile and uncooperative. He hated police and made that clear. West's report says, quote, "After explaining the purpose for our visit, we were immediately met with a continuous barrage of verbal abuse," end quote. Jerry ranted that he'd been contacted by the Lane County authorities on more than one occasion with regard to the case, and he vehemently denied being involved. After Jerry calmed down and Detective West was able to actually talk to him, he felt that Jerry was just a loudmouth nut, and there wasn't any actual evidence linking him to the crime. Jerry was just one of the many, many people like this. Individuals who were talked to for one reason or another, who on paper looked good for the murders, but who turned out to have nothing to do with them. On June 14, 1987, the Register-Guard ran a long article in commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the double murder. Eric's stepfather and mother, Ted and Donna, said they had spent thousands of dollars on counseling to help them cope with Eric's death. A quote from Ted, "Your whole life, your whole perspective changes. A lot of things we used to like the outdoors, that's gone. Our inherent trust of people is non-existent. It's not a philosophical thing, it's fear. We've never been back up to Fall Creek." Dan Goldstrand, Eric's younger brother, had left home as soon as he was eligible to join the Navy. "I had to go," he told the paper. "If I wasn't home on time to the minute, my mother wanted to call the police. They were smothering me." Carl Goldstrand, Eric's father, said after his son's slaying, he had fallen off the wagon even though he'd been sober for years before Eric was killed. He said of the murder, quote, "I couldn't keep my mind off it. It was a complete obsession, wanting to find who did it, being angry at the world, the police, everyone, the unfairness of it all." Because of his alcoholism and anger, his marriage fell apart and he became a, quote, basket case. However, in 1985, Carl married a woman he met through an alcohol recovery program. His new wife, Lucy's older sister, had been murdered many years earlier, and they understood each other, shared each other's burdens, as she told the paper. Despite his happiness with his new wife, Carl told the Register-Guard after Eric was killed he had never regained the zest for life he originally had. Lliana Adank was now handicapped after several heart attacks in the wake of his daughter's murder. The Adanks as well said they didn't feel safe wherever they were. Desperate for resolution, they had consulted psychics about their daughter's murder, including one who told them to look for an old barn with writing on it. I think she had that confused with the April Tinsley case, which I covered in Season 1. The Register Guard reporter traveled up to the Broken Bowl campground with Ron Eggleston, the captain who was in charge of the detectives unit for the sheriff's department way back when the case began. Eggleston said frankly that the investigation never got off the ground. Quote, "We never developed really anything on this particular case that took us anyplace. Most cases you finally get a little bit and that gives you some direction, but not this one." Eggleston questioned how much they could even rely on the evidence they had. He said they found beer cans and a considerable amount of oil in a specific parking lot. That meant that motorcycles had been there, but as he said, does it mean that motorcycles had anything to do with it? Does it mean that beer had anything to do with it? What is evidence and what isn't evidence, he questioned. Eggleston told the Register Guard reporter that he was so obsessed with the case, he used to drive up to Broken Bowl after working hours. Quote, "I would drive up there in the evenings quite often and look and sit and think and hope," he said. His investigators checked out every known sexual assailant in the area. Quote, "They ran down every friend or family member of the couple. They looked for a jealous boyfriend. They looked at whether Eric's mild involvement with drugs led to the murders. They found nothing." Another quote from the article, "Sometimes the sheer brutality of killing both of the youths leads Eggleston to think the murderer may have been a friend or acquaintance." He said, quote, "Even the real bad guys don't just kill two people like that. The reason you do that is because someone knows you. Eggleston doesn't expect that the case will ever be solved unless the killer confesses. Quote, "You've got to have evidence. If you have just a little bit of evidence, you can generally get someone to talk. But without any evidence at all, ... And there you have it. The case was cold as ice. In the mid-1990s, a female detective with the Lane County Criminal Investigation Division, Pam McComas, was working on the unsolved Broken Bowl murders. Detective McComas was familiar with the new DNA technology and the state and federal DNA databases that were being established. It was time to do some testing on the physical evidence in Lliana and Eric's case. In 1995, Detective McComas submitted several items of physical evidence found at the crime scene to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab for DNA testing. Amazingly, despite the lack of awareness about evidence packaging and storage in 1977, the vaginal swabs taken from Lliana at her autopsy and the 2 towels were both determined to have viable DNA from semen on them. A consistent male STR profile was obtained from the semen and was submitted to CODIS, but no matches were ever obtained over the ensuing decades. The STR DNA profile would prove useful only to eliminate suspects throughout the course of the investigation. More time passed. Detective West eventually picked the case back up, and he and then the cold case team he was a part of spent a lot of time looking into so-called campground murders bearing similarities to Eric and Lliana's case, and they had quite a few to work with. In 2000, Randy Yates, a veteran, married father, and seemingly upstanding citizen, was arrested for a 1990s-era series of murders of sex workers in Spokane, Washington. After Yates's arrest, he agreed to plead guilty to 13 murders in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. Most of these were the sex worker slangs the Spokane police were aware of. But one murder Yates copped to surprised them: the 1975 double murder of Patrick Oliver and Susan Savage. You'll remember I said that the investigators on Eric and Lliana's case met with the Spokane authorities because the two cases were so similar. Patrick and Susan had been shot to death while camping in Walla Walla in July 1975. Randy Yates, at the time a 23-year-old prison guard in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, had come across the college students and decided to kill them. Yates's confession closed the quarter-century-old murder investigation, but it didn't provide answers in the Broken Bowl campground case. I'm not sure if Yates was questioned about those murders at the time of his confession, but none of the murders he admitted to were in Oregon at all. Since Yates was arrested in 2000, his DNA went into CODIS, and so the Lane County investigators knew his DNA was not a match. Yates was a totally different predator who shot a young couple in the woods in the 1970s. In 2005, it happened again. This from CNN. A couple in their 50s, Stephen Haugen and Jeanette Bauman, were shot to death along with their Labrador Retriever, Caesar, while camping near Campers Flat Campground in the Willamette National Forest on June 30th, 2005. Stephen and Jeanette had no enemies. He was a school counselor and she was a business teacher. The only things missing from the campground were some camping gear and their license plates from their 1997 GMC Jimmy SUV. This from the Register Guard, quote, "Detectives found no fingerprints, no useful tire tracks, no footprints. No one reported seeing the crime or hearing anything unusual." Both had been shot with a long gun or rifle from at least 15 feet away. Both had turned to face the shooter before they died. There was no sign of a struggle or sexual assault." End quote. Police were stymied as to a motive. It's not clear what the reasoning is. Is it a robbery? We have a profile of the killer or killers with the help of FBI resources. One theory is it could be a crime of territory. Lieutenant Randy Smith of the Lane County Sheriff's Office told CNN, meaning that the couple had possibly fallen victim to some territorial psychopath who felt he owned that swath of the woods. The murders of Jeanette and Stephen and Caesar remained unsolved the following year. According to the Register Guard, the similarities of the 2005 case to the unsolved Goldstrand and Adank case inspired the 2006 investigators to take another look at the 1977 double homicide. An all-volunteer cold case team comprising 3 retired investigators took shape at the Lane County Sheriff's Office. According to the Register Guard, they were 2 retired sheriff's deputies and a former Oregon State Police trooper, and they had over 90 years combined law enforcement experience. One of the investigators was now retired investigator Kurt West, and one of the first cases the cold case team took on was Eric and Lliana's unsolved murder. One of the most intriguing campground murder suspect Detective West and the cold case team investigated was Joseph Henry Burgess. Burgess was a religious zealot who had fled the U.S. to Canada in the late 60s in order to avoid the draft during the Vietnam War. In Canada, he lived on Vancouver Island in a cult commune and was known to extensively quote the Bible and act holier than thou, but also to tote around a .22 caliber rifle. Burgess made multiple comments to others indicating his religious principles were offended by an unmarried young couple who lived in a tent on Radar Beach. The couple, 20-year-old Anne Durant and 19-year-old Swedish exchange student Leif Carlson, was found dead on the morning of June 21, 1972, both shot in the head with a .22 while they slept. 25-year-old Burgess vanished, leaving behind all his personal items including his Bible and his glasses, but he took his rifle with him. His fingerprints were on documents in the dead couple's tent, so the investigators knew he was the shooter, but they couldn't find him. Well, in 2009, he turned up. For more than 10 years, he'd been living off the grid in the mountains of Albuquerque, New Mexico, breaking into unoccupied cabins to steal food, tools, booze, and supplies. No one knew who the mysterious burglar and thief was, and he was nicknamed the Cookie Bandit because of the snacks he made off with. But there was nothing cute about this guy. He was dangerous. In July 2009, the 62-year-old broke into his last cabin. 2 Sandoval County Sheriff's deputies who were determined to catch the Cookie Bandit hid in the cabin and waited for him to break in. When he did, they put cuffs on him, but he managed to grab a pistol from his waistband and shoot Sergeant Joe Harris. Burgess was fatally wounded by a bullet Harris managed to fire in the melee, but Harris died in the hospital. After he was killed, Burgess, a.k.a. the Cookie Bandit, was identified as the suspect who killed the couple in Canada in 1972. So now, in 2009, Detective West was all in on Burgess, who had disappeared from Vancouver Island in 1972 after murdering a couple in a tent and could easily have been living off the grid in Oregon in 1977, continuing to prey on camping couples. West made arrangements to test Burgess's DNA against the DNA in evidence and was surprised and disappointed that Burgess was not the shooter. I have to say how incredible it is how many people are out there shooting couples in campgrounds. Again, one of the many reasons I don't camp. Over the next few years, the cold case team continued to eliminate people in the case file, suspects who crossed their radar or people who were the subject of tips, using the DNA profile they had in evidence. One of these was the Benito M. Detective West actually got Benito's name from Carl Goldstrand, who had received a tip from an acquaintance, a woman named Lliana. She said she'd been with this guy Benito. He was drunk and he started bragging about something he'd done. He'd been camping in the woods and he saw a young couple. Quote, he then stated that he shot the couple, hitting both the male and female with 1 bullet. He bragged about being a former Navy SEAL and how he considered himself an excellent marksman, end quote. Deanna was familiar with the murders at Broken Bowl, as she used to hang out at Fall Creek herself until the murders happened. She decided to tell Carl Goldstrand about this because Benito's cavalier attitude about the murders freaked her out. Benito's name was not in the case file and his DNA was not in CODIS. So in July 2012, Springfield Police Detective Sergeant David Lewis and cold case investigator West knocked on Benito's door and told him they were investigating a burglary nearby and the suspect had left his blood behind. They told him the neighbor whose house had been burgled named Benito as the suspect, and they asked him to give DNA to prove it wasn't him. He willingly did so. In January 2013, Benito M. was ruled out as the source of the crime scene DNA in the Goldstrand and Adank case. Then another name came up, or rather backup. This was Sean S., the long-term boyfriend of Lliana Adank pre-Eric, who had been questioned back in the day. Sean was now in the Lane County Jail on sodomy charges. His name was called in as a tip from the mother of the victim in that case, who said that Sean told her all about the Fall Creek murders that happened back in '77. He also said that he used to date the female victim, Lliana. According to this tipster, quote, Sean said he had been the prime suspect, but because his dad said he was working for him that day or night at Trueline, his dad's business, the police did not charge him, end quote. He told the tipster that his parents would have told the cops anything to make them go away. Detective West went to visit Sean at the jail in October 2011 and told him they were still investigating his ex-girlfriend Lliana's case. West asked for a DNA sample, which Sean readily provided. After DNA testing, OSP Crime Lab analyst Janelle Moore ruled Sean S. out in January 2013. This is the end of Part 1 of the case of Eric Goldstrand and Lliana Adank. Part 2 is available right now.